Can you introduce me to Saudi Arabia and the regional countries around it, beyond the cliche of oil, desert, religious fundamentalism, and the extreme riches?
Well, I think one of the things about this part of the world called the Gulf, if you're from the Gulf, you call it the Arabian Gulf. A lot of the world refers to it as the Persian Gulf, which is controversial there. Those countries didn't really have borders, right? This was a place of wandering tribes, people called Bedouins, who lived in a subsistence lifestyle. So the people along the coast had a slightly different experience than the people in the deep desert. The people on the coast were pearl divers, and they would change their job by the time of the year and the weather. Cool. In Saudi Arabia, there was something different because it's the birthplace of Islam. It's also this kind of much bigger country in the region. So it has this history of the spice route that went through it. It has Mecca and Medina, of course, itself, which is the most important thing about Saudi Arabia until more recently, when it became a bigger country. That was the reason everyone in the world would want to go, because all Muslims are supposed to go in their life once to Mecca and Medina. And also, Saudi Arabia also has a bit more of a richer kind of history, in the sense that the same people that were settled in Jordan, they're called the Nabateans, they also were in Saudi Arabia. So if you remember from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the final scene with that kind of carved structure.
Yeah. Isn't that in Jordan?
That's in Jordan.
Yeah.
But the same people carved the same kind of thing in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Only recently they started to talk about it, because it was kind of like pre-Islamic. So it didn't go over well with the conservatives. So anyway, so Saudi Arabia is similar to its neighbors like the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, but it has a different historical precedence. And because it's way bigger, it has way more oil because it has more land. The population is bigger. So it's kind of a more impactful country in the world. But for a long time, it didn't really use its full heft, because some of the people that came after the founder, Abdulaziz, were sort of not interested in anything other than continuing the status quo, being the king, being the royal family ruling Saudi Arabia. And so recently now it's kind of risen to the global stage in a way it never before.
How is the oil by barrels, if distributed amongst these various nations?
Well, it's all kind of in the same general zone. So Saudi Arabia doesn't really have a huge coastal like natural gas and oil, because their side is the Gulf of Aqaba, that Red Sea side. And whereas the UAE and Qatar have the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, where there's natural gas. So they have some differences. Saudi Arabia has the most oil, though, of all these groups. And it's all kind of deep in the desert. There's an area that's where most of it is. And actually, there used to be a lot of disputes on the borders between Kuwait and Abu Dhabi and Saudi, because do you remember the movie There Will Be Blood?
Yeah. Drainage.
Yeah. So basically, they're all kind of tapping into the same reservoir, and it's quite kind of controversial. But and they had actually like shots were fired in the 20th century over these borders. But Saudi Arabia has the biggest oil supplies.
And with today's oil price, do you have any indication for what the raw dollar amount per annum each of these nations might be extracting from the ground?
I don't know off the top of my head the numbers, but this is like multi-generational wealth being drawn up. And so until recently, a lot of that money was saved in the form of a sovereign wealth fund. So sovereign wealth funds are just giant savings accounts of countries for future generations. And so Abu Dhabi is famous for its sovereign wealth fund. So is Kuwait. Saudi didn't really have a sovereign wealth fund like we think of until recently. But these are hundreds of billions of dollars. Most of their economy is supported by this. All of their public services, and until recently, even everything was given away almost for free. So like energy, like electricity and houses, water, but it all comes from the oil.
Yeah. Since these countries are monarchies, the Public Investment Fund, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, QAI, KI, etc., can we treat these sovereign wealth funds as almost personal bank accounts of the ruling families?
I think there's very different structures in place in every country. So, for example, and that changes over time. So, for example, in Abu Dhabi, the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, for most of history, has been nobody could touch it. Like the royals didn't really touch that account.
Okay.
And it became an institution, and it was a very passive global investor. More recently, things have changed because needs change. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, the Public Investment Fund is kind of a very different story. It's not an institution. It was a historical company that just held a few government stakes. And basically, it was on the shelf. And Prince Mohammed took it off the shelf and said, this is the thing that we're going to turn into a sovereign wealth fund. So then they kind of reshaped it. They put money into it. They put a new building. They changed the logo. And I would say, because of the way Saudi Arabia is run, PIF is firmly under his control. There's no institutional thing that's going to block him. There's no balance of power in Saudi Arabia among brothers. Right. Whereas in Abu Dhabi, there's a very delicate balance of power among brothers. MBS just has all power in Saudi Arabia, all 100%. So every institution is really only answerable to him. So you could argue it's a personal bank account in that sense, but I would say he doesn't treat it that way. What it does is it reflects his interests for the future of Saudi Arabia. It doesn't invest in things for his own use. Like it doesn't own palaces that he lives in, or
he's not
things
direct
like
debiting.
that. Yeah, so that all of that stuff, his personal expenditures happen somewhere else.
Yep.
But PIF is very much his vision for the future of the country. So a lot of the things they do, if it came from above, it will happen. If it came from below, there's a small chance it will happen.
Distinction between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The Emirates, MBZ is the ruling guy there. MBS in Saudi Arabia, PIF. The Shia-Sunni divide between these two nations, actually how critical that is in understanding the differences and how they operate in the world.
Well, in the Gulf countries, there's only really one country that has a more of a Shia feel. That's Bahrain, the island off of Saudi Arabia, with a deep relationship with Saudi Arabia. But during the Arab Spring, there was a kind of Shia revolt against the royal family. Abu Dhabi has a very small number of Shia, but there is a kind of a tension, mostly because of because within Islam, within the Middle East, Shias are more generally, alongside Iran. Not to say they are, but that's how it's been perceived. Saudi Arabia is a very Sunni place. The UAE is a very Sunni place as well. Qatar is a very Sunni place. Kuwait is a very Sunni place. But there's pockets of Shia, except for Bahrain.
And how those differences reflected in culture, attitudes, behavior?
I don't think if you were to meet, or if anyone were to meet a Shia or a Sunni in most of those places, no one would notice something very different. There's very strong differences in the practice of the religion, but it's actually pretty assimilated. Now, where there's more of a divide is between those Gulf states and, for example, Iraq or Lebanon or Iran. That's where there's, just differences about who should be in charge and that sort of thing. There's no Shia monarchies anymore. Okay. Iran used to be a Shia monarchy. So the monarchs are Sunnis. And so there's a kind of a political difference as well,
Going back to just sort of understanding this region, how many generations before MBS, Mohommed bin Salman, were they warlords fighting on camelback?
Yeah, so that happened. So MBS is the son of one of the sons of the founder.
So his grandfather was one of these warlords.
So his grandfather was a true Bedouin. He was born in the desert, more or less, and lived a difficult lifestyle. He took control of the country by force, by an aggressive move. And at that time, it was a pretty Wild West kind of place. Yeah. And then oil was discovered quite a ways into his monarchy. And then he had a lot of children over time. And because he had so many children with so many different wives, his oldest son and his youngest son, there's like a generation between them, Yeah. So that for a long time, Saudi Arabia's kings were just his sons going down the line of age. Right, and so King Salman, the current king of Saudi Arabia, was one of his younger sons, that's still alive, but he's a very old man now.
So then how many years since this founder of Saudi Arabia passed away?
Oh, I don't actually remember the year he passed away, but I guess it would have been something like, let's just look it up. Maybe.
Oh, we can just do it generally, because the reason why I'm asking is rather to emphasize how remarkable it is that in that short period of time, they've gone to NEOM. Yeah,
right. Well, I think it's, equivalent of 100 years between sort of the era when oil was discovered and the era when NEOM is being built. And if you go back to those 1920s kind of period, there's all these funny letters and things. One time I ran across an article. It was a letter from an American journalist who accidentally ended up in Riyadh on a trip.
Okay.
And at one point,
in the 20s,
Abdulaziz came up to him and said, "Listen, can you take a message back to the president of the United States? We need a few tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
It's really difficult here. I have to buy clothes for everyone and food, and we just need a little bit of a top up,
Yeah.
So, and it's now how different things are now, and but yeah, over that time, an extraordinary wealth was discovered and began to be harvested, and there's still quite a lot of oil left too.
Mm-hmm. Is there any? Do the geologists know with a high degree of certainty how much oil is left?
I think that's something I'm not an expert on, but what I do know is that there's a growing feeling among these Gulf states that they can't rely on this oil forever, that the value of the oil could go down over time.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a energy revolution, all that oil is suddenly no longer useful.
Yeah.
So if you say we've got 2 million barrels or whatever, or millions of barrels, it doesn't really matter if the price is going to go down.
Yeah. So young MBS, because Blood and Oil is kind of a biography of MBS, but then all the broader stories and implications on the region told through the story of this man's life. He seems to have been this undisciplined brat, essentially. Very badly behaved. He just wanted to play video games all day. Very spoiled child, especially in comparison to his brothers, who whilst were also spoiled, but they were learning languages, attending international universities, practicing the scripture, etc. So MBS differed in so many ways from the people who grew up around. But despite all of that, he's now the leader. So how much do you think of MBS is his nature versus his nurture?
Well, I think there are some big differences. So King Salman had a first batch of children with his first wife. And by the time he got to his third wife, which is MBS's mom, he had grown quite a bit older. So it's almost like the age gap between him and his dad is almost similar to someone who would typically be your grandfather. Right. And anybody knows that a young father versus an old father, there's a big difference in the nature. A young father is like stricter and harder, and an older father is more accepting and things. So that might explain a little bit about some of the dynamics. The other thing is MBS, he wasn't as drawn to this kind of international life of luxury, with going to horse races, wearing the cravat at an event in London and things like that. He didn't really learn English until recently. More, he was a real, like a genuine Saudi, and he was very close with his dad and just sort of stuck with him, at all of his big jobs he had as the governor of Riyadh, and traveling the world with his dad. So there's a huge difference between him, his brothers, and then his half brothers who are older. Yeah. And so I wouldn't call him a brat, but I would say he was always a bit of a rogue or a maverick, and had this sense from a young age. He pursued what he was interested in, like video games and things like that. But he also had this sense that the whole world could be changed by his actions. Okay. So, and everyone was discounting him as well. And so it kind of put a chip on his shoulder as well.
That perfectly tees up the next point, which is how ominous is it that MBS idealizes and romanticizes Alexander the Great, and then openly admits to his role model being Niccolo Machiavelli.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because, this has been my experience. I'm not some expert on history or historic leaders, but I think there are some people, and they could be a business leader or they could be a political leader, depending on how they end up in the world. If MBS had been born in America, maybe he'd be an entrepreneur. I don't know. Right. But for him, for these kinds of people, they see that the course of history in the future is decided by man-made actions. Mm-hmm. So they don't believe that things will be as they were and that things can be changed radically. I mean, MBS always surprises everyone by doing something that he thinks is the right thing to do that doesn't fit with what most people think would be the right thing to do, you know? So who would think it would be the right thing to do to launch a war or whatever it might be? And he just had a great decisiveness about him. Mm-hmm. But I think probably over time, looking back, some of that decisiveness could be considered ill-advised, So I think he's what I find most fascinating about him is that there was nothing about him that suggested he would take this path when he was
Right.
younger. He was very interested in business. He'd opened a lot of companies. He even had a Japanese manga company in Saudi Arabia, which just shows these are the things that were on his mind at that time, you know. And it was only later on when history put this situation in front of him that he kind of grabbed the reins.
I think this is from memory, a bit of detail from the book as well, that he learned his ruthlessness by reading about American tycoons. And so since he was already rich because he was a Saudi prince, maybe it's just that ambition for power that maybe led him down this other path to try and seize as much political family power as he could get, versus with all of the options he could have had to have, you know, been this Aramco CEO or something like that.
I think he was always very enamored by the world of business and American business and the idea of creating companies and, you know, creating inventions that change the way everybody experiences the world. So he's definitely a lot more inspired by that than political figures, you know, and that goes for now too. You don't really see MBS as a very political person. You know, he's not deeply engaged with the history of the Israel-Palestinian issue. Yeah. And there were lots of people in the royal family that were like that, and he kind of sidelined them right away. He just wasn't interested. He just wants results for the country. You see the way he, everyone's held according to KPIs. You know, there's a very businessy feel to Saudi Arabia.
Does his ambition set him apart from his family, or are there equally ambitious people in there? He just managed to consolidate power better.
Well, as far as I've ever come across, nobody ever had as much ambition as him. I mean, most people that would think they were best positioned to become the king, they just wanted that power. They didn't actually have a vision for Saudi Arabia. They just said, I would be great as this role, or I'm powerful enough, or I know enough people, or
just
whatever it is.
Status alone.
Yeah, the status and their job, their role, their idea was to continue doing exactly what they were already doing. Yeah. And every king before MBS didn't really have an ambitious agenda for the country. It was always very glacial and gradual.
So you opened the book by teasing the Shiek Down, which was potentially the most brazen thing that he's done so far. Could you take us through how significant the transfer of power was during the Shiek Down?
So as MBS rose up, first his dad became the king. That was inevitable. Nobody could take that away once that happened. But already there was people maneuvering to be the second in line for the throne, knowing that the king was quite old, and that they wanted to kind of be in position to sideline the son. So he had a journey ahead of him in the early days, which was he needed better intelligence about everyone else. He needed like his own sort of private police. So he started to amass these tools that would allow him to cement his control. And one of his things is ambition and sense of surprise. So everybody in the world, including me, you know, all kinds of people, business leaders and journalists, went to Saudi Arabia for this thing called the FII, Future Industries Initiative. It was the Davos in the Desert conference. And we all went to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and we went to these events, and it was quite a scene. And then only weeks later, this event happened where all of these princes, business people that together were worth probably $500 billion.
That's insane.
They were taken to the Ritz, which was converted into like a makeshift prison. And it was this kind of night of the long knives, completely behead anybody's efforts to take power or to have power, you know? And that includes his own cousins and some of the most famous Saudis that the world knows. And to me, that is one of the most crazy things that's happened in our recent history in the world.
Right.
Because I don't think we'll see it again, something quite like that.
Because of just of how significant the short time and then size of the power was, which was changed.
Yeah, like you sometimes read about these things. Like I remember I used to live in Cairo, and you go on the tour of this historic thing called the Citadel, and they told the story of this Ottoman leader who invited everyone in powerful positions to this dinner, but it was actually just a ruse, and he killed them all. You know, so like that's like a thing you learn about in a museum. I think in Saudi Arabia someday, 100 years from now, you'll hear about the Ritz crackdown. And probably by then it will be completely recast as only a corruption cleansing effort, you know? Right. And there's truth to that. There was elements of that, but it was completely, there was no due process. I mean, people were just said, a stack of papers were put down as, we know that you have this money. We know that you did these corrupt deals. There was no chance to argue. You just had to say, okay, well, what do I do? You know, and they'll say, okay, well, you sign it over to the Saudi treasury and then you can go.
Or we keep torturing you until you do.
Well, and the torture part is a little controversial. There was a case of somebody that claimed to have been tortured, but in general, the torture was being imprisoned. It was being imprisoned in the Ritz, not being able to do anything. And even in today, the people who didn't quite cooperate or who didn't gain the trust of MBS, they wear ankle bracelets still. There's many powerful people, former ministers, former billionaires who have ankle bracelets in Saudi Arabia.
The most significant people in the Ritz prison, just maybe 2 or 3, what their name was, why they were powerful, and then why MBS perceived them as a threat.
Yeah, I think, well, the most famous one was Walid bin Talal, who was, for many decades, the Saudi that was most well known in the West. He was kind of a quirky guy, but he made big investments in American companies, and he was considered like this independently wealthy Saudi person. What people didn't realize during that time was that he was just controlling other people's money. It wasn't his money. It was actually members, higher up members in the royal family, like the king. They let him have that public image, but in reality, it was their money. So he was put in there, and that was a big deal. There was several of the sons of King Abdullah, the previous king, that were put in there, and one of them was Turkey bin Abdullah, which we talk about a lot in the book. These were very powerful people. If under the previous regime were untouchable as the sons of the king of Saudi Arabia, nowadays they can't leave the country. The whole bin Abdullah part of the family is heavily controlled. You don't see bin Abdullahs traveling around Paris and London anymore. So that was probably his most aggressive political move in the family. And then there's other kind of just people that you didn't know were among the richest people on earth. Like there was people in there that had some no-name job or low-level job that had tens of billions of dollars.
Crazy.
Like the head of protocol of the former king, that guy had tens of billions of dollars. He should have been on the Forbes most rich people on earth list. And that's kind of how bad things had gotten in Saudi Arabia. So much was being siphoned off,
So this fella, the head of protocol, he can amass that type of wealth through pure corruption, just handouts from people.
Well,
that is the state's money.
I think it's because so much of what happens had to go through him, and so he was able to just quadruple the budgets and just take everything. Exactly. And that was happening all over Saudi Arabia. So in a way, what people are not fair about MBS with is he was dealing with absolutely the worst corruption crisis on earth.
Corruption,
But at the same time, what people criticize rightly is there's no due process, because what if some of those people weren't corrupt? They still lost their money. Like there was kind of everybody was tarnished with the same brush.
And from memory, there was one person who was caught up in the Ritz that had started a travel agency for themselves, and they were booking student flights at the most economy rate, but then charging the Saudi government first-class tickets on the most expensive route. And it was a really nice example of how insignificant the corruption might seem, but over time that can accrue tremendous wealth, and is obviously it's stealing from the state essentially.
This head of protocol guy had a house with 100 rooms in it. After he was arrested and his money was taken away, that house was taken over by the government and turned into a hotel. That's how crazy this stuff was.
So this shakedown was the ultimate consolidation of power. Before that, was there still a lot of question marks over whether this young MBS with his huge ambition could actually rise to the top of the family, and therefore this was an extremely risky move to take?
The only person that wanted MBS to the rise to the top of the family was MBS, and maybe his dad. Every other person there thought, I'm more equipped, I'm more experienced, I have better education, and they all had some reason. But Mohammed took these efforts right away to start to cement things, and he had a lot of things he had to get past. He had to get past the fact that another guy was the crown prince ahead of him, that there's all these rich people that are out to get him. They're just plotting every night how they're going to get rid of him. And so he just was more aggressive, faster. There's a phrase, always be early. He was the earliest. He moved first. No one would have expected 2 weeks after that huge conference showing off Saudi Arabia to the Western world that he would take this move. It was just, people couldn't. And that's, in a way, when we were writing the book, we were like, we have to go back to the beginning and start again, because it was such a whirlwind when this was happening. You were like, wait, I thought we were saying this, now we're saying that. And, it was keeping up with it was hard, you know?
So MBS has exposed himself to risk of ruin. potentially blowing up from the sense that he takes this huge political risk. The intelligence leaks and it stopped before it could ever happened. The Shiek Down could have spelled his end. Kidnapping the Lebanese prime minister, which he does later in the book, could have spelt his end. The blatant murder of Khashoggi could have definitely spelt his end. In your opinion, how much do we credit MBS's ability as an operator and assessor of risk versus him just getting a little bit lucky a couple of times?
Well, I suppose he is a little bit lucky, but he was also always looking behind his back. He was always looking over his shoulder all the time, and he knew what people were doing because he had developed this kind of private intelligence network that could tap the phones, that could read emails, it could he even accessed the secret database of Twitter at the time to find out who certain people were that were leaking things. So he was very vigilant about that. So I wouldn't give that part to luck. The luck part is just he took so many risks that one of them could have blown up and one of them could have had a black swan thing that just took him out. But it's also important to notice that was the first 5 years of MBS. We've now been, another period of time after that where his leadership, his decisions are very different than the first 5 years, So I think he's also somebody who's learning on the job. I think he's also someone who a lot of people think MBS is a very emotional person. He's been cast as a emotional tyrant. But one of the examples that I think is the best is if there's anybody on earth that should be the sworn enemy of MBS, it would be Erdogan in Turkey. Because after the murder of Khashoggi, the reason that took off to such an extent was that they tapped this consulate through their own intelligence, and then they leaked it out day by day, a bit more. And they didn't respond to any requests from Saudi Arabia. Hey, wait, let's talk about this. Yeah. They really took a kill shot, MBS. That was the whole plan. And it was leaking out too. They were saying MBS's uncles and father were going to remove him. And it was all kind of leaked in the hopes that was true. Years later, there's a picture of MBS with Erdogan in Jeddah, like friendly as can be. No sign of animosity. Same thing about Qatar. A very heated dispute. And then now, no, they don't seem to think about it anymore. Wow. He doesn't really hold a grudge. Right. And that's the sign of somebody who can really persist in power, because if you let your emotions take over, you're going to make some mistakes. But it seems to me like he's able to really compartmentalize.
What motivated Erdogan to try and take a kill shot?
Well, everybody wants to control who's in charge of Saudi Arabia, or they want to have some design on who that could be, whether it's for political power or business reasons or whatever it might be. But MBS all around was considered a wild card. Even the UAE, they originally were helping him rise to power, and then now you can really sense that they regret it, because this is a person who now speaks to them like he's the one in charge of the region. And they thought, wait, I thought we were equals at least, if not a more kind of avuncular relationship between MBZ and MBS. So I don't think there's a lot of people that were rooting him on in the region, because he's a little bit of a wild card. You never know what's going to happen. He might, try something out on you. I think there was allegations, though never proven, that he was trying to shape the political future of Jordan through some shenanigans, So you can tell, even if that's not true, that people are worried that he's got designs,
You brush up against MBZ in the book, but he seems like a fella that could have a book dedicated to it himself.
Yeah, and there's actually a really interesting book I read recently, which is about his dad, the founder. But MBZ was, one of the sons of Zayed, who was the one that united all these kind of disparate tribes. So the United
Emirates.
Yeah, United Arab Emirates is made up of these different tribes that could have all gone their own way. And at one point, there was even a plan for a broader United Arab Emirates that would have included Bahrain and Qatar, but didn't work out in the end. So Zayed was the kind of great unifier. That's his sort of claim to fame. And he had his eldest son became the president, called Khalifa, Prince Khalifa. And president in UAE is the equivalent of king. There's no king. And then one of his sons, MBZ, went to military school. He was kind of the military son, and he played a very huge role in the development of the country. Though, in reality, there's a bit of a balance of power between him and his brothers, because they, like Abdulaziz, King Zayed, had a lot of different sons, and so they all think of themselves as up for the job of being in charge. So there's a bit more of a balance of power there compared to in Saudi.
And I heard Chamath Palihapitiya singing MBZ's praises recently. So is he as well a very influential figure in international business?
Yeah, he is. I mean, he's UAE has been a very important ally of the United States in particular, and there's a lot of alliance between the two, and I think that's on purpose. MBZ was the architect of that. He's also done some really interesting things. Like one of the things I found very interesting in Abu Dhabi is there's this New York University campus that they built, and most of the foreign campuses you see built in Gulf states are just like essentially buying the name and then having your local students go there. But this NYU campus is it's like a full scholarship for anybody in the world to apply.
Cool.
So a lot of the students are from Ethiopia or wherever it is in the world. And I met some of these students and I was like, what are these guys doing in Abu Dhabi? It's quite a visionary idea to say, we're going to make a really great university here in Abu Dhabi.
That's pure meritocracy.
There's a meritocracy. There's a few people can get in from our country, but most of them can't.
Yeah.
And just to set the bar and also to kind of build this relationship with ambitious young people over time. So, and there's been a lot of
generationally.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of investments in culture, a lot of mistakes too, just like any of the Gulf states or any state, to be honest. Yeah. But and then so Sheikh Khalifa died, and then MBZ became the president, and now his son is the crown prince. Mm-hmm. And then there's another powerful guy called Tahnoon, who's kind of not the crown prince, but he's got a lot of power. That is kind of a little bit of a balance of power.
So these figures are unknown due to the secrecy of the institutions, but do you have any sense from the reporting you've done what the assets under management would be for the PIF or ADIA?
Well, ADIA, people have speculated over the years. I think it rose as high as like 800 billion, and I would say it's probably like $500 billion worth of assets. It would be my guess. And then PIF is probably below that, but theoretically is on the rise because they keep putting more money in from selling Aramco shares.
Interesting. I only read the other day that they speculated ADIA was 1.2 trillion, but it could have just been about source.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation like that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's true. I've seen a range of things. It's fair to say it's a big number,
Yeah.
and
an enormous number.
Everyone wants it to be a trillion because it sounds exciting, but
Yeah.
in reality, I don't think that's true. They have to pull from that for different reasons too, sometimes.
Sure, and so these sovereign wealth funds are funding a lot of domestic infrastructure, energy domestically, all types of stuff like that. But as well, they're very diversified portfolios because the PIF owns Newcastle United, ADIA owns Manchester City, PIF owns Live, potentially going to merge with the PGA Tour.
Well, actually, what you're describing is some different ones because PIF and Mubadala are considered more similar. Mubadala is kind of a different sovereign fund.
Is that Saudi as well?
That's in Abu Dhabi.
Okay.
ADIA, the investment authority, typically owns more boring stuff. It doesn't own like exciting stakes. It doesn't take an active role. Like I remember historically, they actually own a lot of the parking meters in Chicago. Like it's just like a nice return, recurring revenue stream. So Mubadala and PIF are considered these kind of more exotic form of sovereign wealth, which is active. It's trying to drive things, like make a difference. And PIF has a lot of sort of trophy assets, like when they bought the Uber stake, probably not at the right valuation or anything, but it was to kind of say, hey, we are in the world,
And what about the culture washing and the sports washing that these institutions are now trying to achieve?
Well, I think I always avoid those terms because if you spend time in those countries, it's very offensive to say you built this museum because you're culture washing, or you sponsored the sports match to sportswash. If you think about it, especially in Saudi, so MBS he's in power, right, by his own hand, but he still has a mandate from a population, and his mandate is from the young population, the under 30s, which represent more than 70% of the country. Yeah. There was a big demographic explosion.
That's a remarkable statistic. Yeah. 70% of the country is under 30 years old.
Very youthful country.
Wow.
And
all online.
Part of why he's so popular, if you go to Saudi Arabia, among women, among men, is that among anybody who just cares about their everyday life, their cultural freedoms, that was what MBS brought them. He opened the movie theaters, he let music come in, and over time, more and more events and sports are really important to young Saudis. Yeah. So to say that they're only doing it for sports washing is a bit offensive to the population who are diehard football fans, and they're so excited that now these players live here and they're doing this and they're doing these events. if you go to Riyadh, for example, as a visitor, as a guest, like I was on a few occasions, there's not a lot to do, for a visitor. But when I came on my last visit, they had built this thing, which is now a big thing called Riyadh Season, and there's one for every city, and it's kind of like a amusement zone. So it's got like a big fountain and food trucks and things, and that didn't exist before.
Right.
So the same thing goes for sports, So, but on the other hand, they are very concerned, especially Saudi, more than anyone, is very concerned with the global image of Saudi Arabia. And so to show that they have all these exciting things happening in Saudi Arabia is very valuable to them as they try to grow a tourism industry and to get people to move there and re-headquarter their businesses in NEOM and stuff. They need to show that there's a good life here as well. But I don't think that ever MBS has thought, oh, if we have the World Cup here, people will forget about X, Y, and Z. That's just not how they think.
Really?
Okay. That's not in the mind of the people who are running those countries.
Right. Well, that exact motivation was what I was attributing to it, pretty much. With Doha, with the World Cup, people would start to think, oh, what a cool country.
Well, no, but that's not sports washing. That's just advertising your country.
It is laundering your reputation to some degree.
Well, I think the laundering part in those cases are not, well, I'm not sure if laundering is the right word, because they just want you to know this is a nice place, this is an exciting place, whatever it might be. Like, they don't think of themselves as needing to launder themselves. Like, in order to launder yourself, you have to say, I have a stain, right? And they don't think of themselves as having a stain, but they do feel proud. They feel like bragging about their country and to be the biggest, the best, and whatever else. There's a lot of superlatives. I mean, there was a time where all these sovereign wealth funds were competing about who bought the biggest buildings in the other countries in the world, whether London, the Shard, is owned by Qatar. The Chrysler building in New York City is owned by Abu Dhabi. Like, all the tallest buildings are bought by these countries, and there was no business sense in it. Like, especially the ones in New York is just a competition,
So, for instance, take the investment in the Live Golf Tour as an example. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but my assumption is, given the way the PGA operates, the amount of advertising revenue they have, and the type of prize pools they're offering their players versus what Live is doing on all the same metrics, who's watching, how much they're getting paid, etc. This isn't a savvy investment. This is something you do to, whether it's launder, wash, or introduce. Your culture is more similar to ours than you might think, when the truth is it's not.
Well, there may be an element of saying we're more like you than you think we're not, but I think they genuinely believe that, to be honest. I think this is how that deal happened. So in the world of business, there are really smart people, and they are inventing ideas all the time, structures, deals, whatever it might be. There was a deal that was circulating, an idea for how could they upend the world of golf. And you bring it to this party, you bring it to Blackstone, you bring it in different places. You need hundreds of millions to make this happen. It just so happened in the PIF at that time is run by a guy called Yasser Al-Rumayyan, whose best friend is the head of the Saudi Golf Association, who together are the biggest golf fans in golf. Saudi Arabia. And so when this deal came in front of them, they're like, whoa, golf. Okay, interesting. And then it said, okay. And then they had to bring this to MBS and say, look, we have an idea to like up in golf. It might have attracted to him for a variety of reasons. Maybe some of them are reputational. Some of them might have been at the time Trump was the president and he was actually learning to play golf with the hopes of playing golf with
MBS
Trump.
Was?
Yeah.
Okay, nice.
So the golf became a thing for a period of time. And it's also had an interesting business case behind it that we could dominate world golf. And so that's how I see that deal. I don't think it was so simple as we want everyone to think we're like them, but we're actually not,
It's a really interesting take, one that I've never heard. I've always just assumed, all the culture sports washing arguments stood on their own merit. I mean, what's your antidote to that? How do we change the way that we think about these huge investments into culturally sensitive things for people? And you did say they're very similar, but the truth is whilst individually we're all very similar, culturally we're not. And Saudi Arabia is a distinctly different culture to, say, Australia.
But I think if you, as an Australian, go to Saudi Arabia, you're not going to feel like unwelcome. You're going to feel very welcome.
What if I was a Pakistani?
It's hard to say. There's racial things in every country. If you're a Pakistani and you show up in America, you think you're going to be welcomed the same way as an Australian. Not the same, right?
That's true.
So there's innate things like that. It's not so unique just to Saudi Arabia. So I think the truth is, a lot of the things we know. So as somebody who used to be based in other countries, writing about them for another audience, I really could see firsthand how poorly we all do as foreign correspondents to reflect the country.
Right.
Like when I was in a country, we were looking at problems all the time. We weren't ever reflecting the day-to-day life of those places. So inevitably, people in America who read American newspapers are not looking for coverage of Saudi Arabia that's actually all that accurate. They're looking for coverage that tantalizes them in some way.
Confirms their worldview already.
Or confirms their worldview, or it could be, how does it affect me? Because I believe in American power, and how are they going along or against that agenda or whatever it might be. So I think when you see sports washing as a phrase, it's just a politicalized term. Right. It means there's a narrative that we shouldn't let them do this because of this, but it may have nothing to do with the truth. You know?
Amazing. I love that. You just mentioned that one of the sort of aspects of this, whether it's culture watching, sports watching, whatever, could be the attempted relations that they want to create with someone. And a fantastic line from the book was explaining the US-Saudi relationship. There would have been grave deliberations, nights out in the desert, talking under the stars, and then more and more of the same again and again until the US ultimately decided what to do. Is this still characteristic of the Gulf countries' relationship with the US?
No, I think all of the countries have really gone a long way from that. That was back in an era when there was not a lot of worldliness in the Gulf states. These were people who lived their early part of their lives as Bedouins, who had a great knowledge and understanding of how people interact and how to, deal with problems, but were still, as a country, starting to accumulate an institutional knowledge, like a Ministry of Foreign Affairs that's staffed with people who understand foreign affairs, So in those early decades, it was a lot of reliance on the West. Even Aramco originally was a partnership between America and Saudi Arabia, and that's where the name comes from, American Arab Petroleum sort of company. And but over time, as generations went by, those same Saudis went to school in Harvard and Princeton and Oxford and Cambridge. They came back, some of them, and they started to build these institutions. They're still early in their development, but it's clear now that you can't go and order pretty much any of the Gulf states to do anything anymore. Right. So now it's much more of a kind of balance of power. They also can go to China and do things with China, and that's a kind of part of their negotiating position. But the classic example is when Joe Biden was elected, he was saying bad things about Saudi on his rise to power. There was pressure on him to do something. So he said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to meet with the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. I'm only going to meet with the king. It's president meets king. It was an extremely dumb thing to say. Because in reality, the king, so in Saudi Arabia, the king has a royal court and the crown prince has a royal court. That's like a staff that administer their power, right? But the king's royal court was headed by the crown prince. So in reality, MBS was the head of his own court and his dad's court. And his dad was playing this kind of, wise old kind of guidance role, but he was having no involvement in decisions, day-to-day vision, things like that. Saudis can't say this, but that's just the fact. So MBS was entirely in charge. So when you said, I won't speak with the king, I won't speak with MBS, I'll only speak with the king, you basically were saying you'll speak with no one. You won't speak to anyone. And Joe Biden, never got on the phone with the king during that whole period of time. Wow. Then came the day when, guess what? We need something from Saudi. They have Mecca Medina. They have oil. They can change the price of oil. So during this Russia-Ukraine conflict, they needed Saudi Arabia. They wanted them to help ease the price of oil because it had gone up over this conflict. So Joe Biden had no choice. His people called Saudi. They're like, look, if you want to stop by, feel free. So Joe flies all the way to Saudi Arabia, has this meeting, respectful, nodding, no animosity. And he said, what I need you to do is, help us with oil. And he got the famous fist bump, so they refused to shake hands. They did the fist bump.
Is so grim.
But it was very dumb. Yeah. And then he left, and then the message came from Saudi Arabia, no, we're not going to do it. So it was just proof, like, you don't run this place. We run this place, and we're going to do things with our own interests in line. We need that money. If the price of oil is high, great. We can build our things that we want to build, So we're not going to help.
Wow.
And so that's how things are now. There's a lot of security cooperation, but you can't make Saudi do something the way you used to.
Militarily, they still have the strongest relationship with the U.S.
And, they need to play up their independence because they want things from the U.S. So right now, waiting in the wings is a deal between Saudi, Israel, and the U.S., a security pact where Saudi recognizes Israel and develops ties, which is a major change. Right now there's already the Abraham Accords where the UAE and other countries did it, but those are small countries. If Saudi, the home of Mecca Medina, normalizes Israel, it's a big deal. So he hasn't given it up lightly. He wants nuclear power, not nuclear weapons, but nuclear power in the country because it's also a hedge against the future of oil prices. He wants security commitments. He wants all these things from the U.S. The U.S. wants this Israel deal and wants Saudi kind of on the right page. So for him, the UAE did the deal about Israel, but they didn't give very much. But when Saudi does the deal, they're going to get something huge.
Wow.
So it's going to be a leap forward for them. So it's also part of the negotiating posture.
Bradley, it's so fascinating, mate. And you are like an endless trove of information on this region. Building upon that last statement, what is the geopolitical, and you mentioned China earlier, what is the geopolitical significance of this region today projecting into the next 10 years? How important actually are they in real politics?
I mean, all around the world, people are trying to get to these countries. They're standing in the long line trying to get access to money or whatever it might be. So there's the money part. That's clear. That's something real. Though increasingly Saudi's overextended itself. There's also the fact that these are monarchies and they control the legal system and they don't have democracies is also appealing for some efforts. So for example, right now there's a lot of discussions about doing a lot more AI in the Gulf. And one of the reasons is that's out of the jurisdiction of, for example, American courts or whatever, where there might be more regulation, more restrictions. So there's a lot of things that could be happening in that part of the world because of their money, because of their influence, growing influence, even through lobbying, through being a center of sports, whatever it might be. So they're going to be a major player, but they're never going to be like a world power by any means, but they're just kind of this powerful sort of maverick region, and each one of them has a very distinct personality as a country, I'm saying, and it has to do with one simple thing. It's not about like cultural traits or something or one tribe versus another. It's about the Gulf is all about people. It's all about the people in charge. Whereas if you think of America or you think of England, presidents and prime ministers come and go. It can be, some of them can be more than one in a year, and the institutions persist. In the Gulf states, these guys stick around a long time. Like MBS could be the king any day now, and he could last for 50 years. There's no comparison in the world. So these guys, their personalities, their interests, their tastes reflect the country more so than a particular thing about that country, If
MBS dies of a heart attack tomorrow, how much does that all change?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it'd be pretty chaotic. Well, first of all, he's set up things so that all power remains in his branch, right? But his children are too young to take over. He's got probably, most likely, it would be like his brother, Khalid bin Salman, the Minister of Defense. He speaks perfect English, like a very Americanized accent, because he was part of the armed services and he was based in the U.S. As a young prince. So I would guess that would be my guess of who would take over.
Vision.
He's 100% on board with his brother. Very different personalities. He's a really kind of super friendly guy and just has different personality, but that would be where it would stay, But then, then there would be efforts within the whole family to figure out what does that mean? Is he going to change things? Is he going to loosen the stronghold on this members of the family? And so it would be a pretty chaotic moment for the country,
One of my favorite, in fact, the favorite details from the book is the role of these consultancies and these businessmen and so forth. So the international influence of Stephen Schwartzman, Blackstone, Richard Branson, McKinsey, BCG, every consultancy under the sun, Ari Emanuel, Tony Blair. And a theme that you repeatedly emphasized throughout the book, which I really enjoyed, was that they were there to extract as much wealth as possible from the region. But MBS kept whining and dining them in the hope that they themselves would be the ones investing into his vision, rather than just treat him like a rich person to be taken advantage of.
Yeah. Well, this is the key for doing business in the Gulf. Everyone always comes there expecting to walk away with a huge chunk of money to invest or whatever, but that's not how it works anymore. If you have a very compelling offer, maybe it would, but in general, they're looking for a commitment to the region.
Yeah.
If you want to do deals with the UAE or Saudi or Qatar, you need to commit to them and in exchange for them committing to you. And so there's a lot of funny deals. Like, for example, so there was a story not too long ago about how Abu Dhabi invested in this fund, a media fund, and the person who ran this fund is a guy called Arya Burkov, and he told the staff or the investors in this fund, look, we're going to invest in an Abu Dhabi IPO. It had nothing to do with media whatsoever. It was an energy related asset. Yeah. And the people on this committee were like, wait, that doesn't make sense. It's out of our mandate. He's like, just trust me. This is what we're going to do. So they got $1 billion from Abu Dhabi and they put 50 million into this IPO. That shows when they did the IPO, it said this fund was investing in it. It gave this kind of Western confirmation to the IPO. So there's a lot of that kind of back and forth, like people, they expect you to give some money back and improve their image, since that is kind of a washing that you do.
Definitely.
So, but anyways, there's people who provide services. They're just trying to extract money.
The consultancies.
Yeah. And you can see that because the salaries, the number of people, it's just huge. Yeah. And to what extent their plans are going to pay off or even resemble the plans, who knows,
And also they're incentivized very cynically, but they are incentivized to just be yes men to whatever the big vision is. And there's this brilliant detail where the new consultants are brought in to correct the work of the previous consultants, millions and millions of dollars on each end being spent. I just wonder if you ever got any leaks of what those reports looked like. Because there is a cynical part of me that would see these absurd PDF presentations, which have had millions of dollars spent on them, which are just not based in reality. Things like the fake moon and NEOM, the glowing sand, all the rest.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, probably some of these consulting work has been useful in the sense that there was no framework and then there was a framework. Mm-hmm. There was no 2030 plan. Now there is a 2030 plan. There's parts of it that reflect the vision of where they want to be, So directionally, it's okay. But probably in most of those cases, they just are incentivized to tell you the previous report was terrible and we need to fix it, even if it was fine. Yeah. You're never incentivized to cut costs as a consultant, Yeah. So I think they were in need of people who could speak the language of business, at least give a sense of getting things organized. I mean, truthfully, some of these things that are happening in the desert are kind of amazing. People fly in and they build like a mini city to start building the bigger city. And so, and at some point all the consultants are living on a boat off of the edge, So, and on the other hand, if I was a consultant, I would also be charging a lot because I don't want to live in the desert in Saudi Arabia without, being close to my family or entertainment. So there's some of it's justified, but I think they just got addicted to it. And it's going to take some time to kind of kick the habit. Yeah.
Did you see Adam Newman is now building flats in Riyadh?
Not surprised.
I just saw it on LinkedIn. I didn't go into it too much. But something like a $9 billion deal.
Yeah.
An extraordinary amount of money.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the guy, he seems to be the cat with 9 lives.
And NEOM, how much of this is absurd versus... I also get the sense from you do have a deep admiration for the region generally. Like you admire that they have created this out of, it's not nothing, it's a lot of money, but out of what was before sand dunes. So correct me if I'm wrong. Is that the case?
And I have a great affection for the Middle East in general, the culture, the language, the history. And I've always enjoyed the Gulf states as a visitor and resident at times. So I have no animosity, but I also feel as a journalist, I have to just tell the truth. So sometimes people will think that means I have a negative point of view, but I don't.
NEOM, is this going to happen in our lifetimes? Will it be the Dubai of Saudi Arabia?
I think a lot of what's going on in Saudi Arabia is a bit reckless in the sense that there's so many mega projects like this, like so many pie in the sky. There's another project, they're building a gigantic cube, the biggest building in the world, And in NEOM, it's like the longest building in the world. And what's to admire about it is that they're embracing all of the most cutting edge experimental visions of a utopian future. Yeah. I'm skeptical I would ever want to even visit these places for very long, just because when people try to build a mega project from scratch, it doesn't have that organic feel to it. No. It feels kind of more dystopian, in my feeling, But yeah, I think NEOM is the way to think about NEOM is Mohommed bin Salman has a big vision for the future, and he loves like sci-fi and stuff, So he's not looking to just do gradual things. He's doing crazy things. That's what he wants to see Saudi Arabia be at the forefront of the future, not the back. So with NEOM, with Riyadh, for example, what are you going to do with Riyadh? It's a city. It's already built, mostly built. You can do some stuff there, but you can't really envision a crazy future in Riyadh. So he looked around for a piece of canvas, a piece of land that had some things going for it, like, for example, a coastline. There's not that many coastal cities in Saudi Arabia, famously Jeddah, but there's not like a lot of huge cities on the coast. So that's one appeal. It's beautiful water and all that kind of thing. There's mountains nearby, so that gives it a bit more of a geographic taste. If you think about the location of NEOM, people don't often look at it on the map. It's extremely close to Egypt, to Israel, to Jordan. It's a place that should have more of a central role. It's kind of a crossroads. It's right across from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Anyways, this was a canvas to just invent the future. Yeah. So everything about it, the legal system, there's even talk of, if you wanted to go there as a Saudi, you have to get a visa, because they were like not sure you could handle this crazy futuristic place. And to give it its own, everything about it is experimental. And so some of the things sound a little bit like a late night, like toking session, like, glowing sand, a moon that rises every night. But in reality, that's probably what it was. It was, they just get around together and say, what if this happened? What if that happened? And then the consultants have to take it overly serious, and then we'll see what actually gets built. In the end, they embrace this idea of like one long city that sounds incredibly expensive and interesting as a concept. Like, there's not many cities that are on the form of a line,
or any. That's a one building.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the truth is, all of these mega projects, we won't be able to see them in their completeness in our lifetime. Some of them, because there's so many at the same time. If they were all focused on one, maybe we'd get faster. But I think in reality, just resource-wise, they can't afford to make all of these things. And so there's a bit of a question. Where's that money going to come from? How much more of Aramco has to be sold?
Right.
They've been putting pressure on their neighbors to invest in NEOM as kind of part of the security bargain. Yep. So recently, Kuwait said, oh, we're going to invest in NEOM. That's clearly not quite what it seems. On the surface, it looks like Kuwait just wants to invest in NEOM. But in reality, it's a kind of behind-the-scenes discussion. Hey, you're the crown prince. You're a bit vulnerable. I will back you as a crown prince in Kuwait if you back us, I will guarantee that if someone invades you, we'll defend you. Nice. But we're going to need to see you invest in NEOM, you know? Yeah. So there's a lot of that going on.
To the point of it being a vision of a late night toking session. In fact, in the book, Mohommed bin Salman was just scrolling Google Maps, saw a place, liked the look of it, jumped in the chopper, went over there. How do you get those types of details?
Well, the thing about it's always hard, right, to figure out how do you get access, how do you get inside the room. And the one thing that's special about MBS is that whole period of time before he was the crown prince, when he was deputy crown prince, before he was even in the circle, he had a lot more interactions with a lot more normal people. Mm-hmm. And also because he was so engaged with business people, they were often along for the ride. So it just gives you a slightly, Justin and I, the co-authors of the book, we were both business reporters at the Wall Street Journal. So that's why we wrote the book and someone else didn't. Like maybe a Middle East expert kind of foreign correspondent could have written a book if he was in the more conventional vein as a leader. But because his world is the world of business and his language is the world of business, it made it easier for us to get inside the room.
And so that type of anecdote does come from someone in the room who you managed to connect with through your network.
Yeah, and often it's unexpected people because, it's not always what you think,
What type of serendipitous emails do you receive on a weekly basis from someone who's connected to someone that has a very, very juicy nugget to a story you're writing?
Well, I wish it happened more often, to be honest, but you do over the years. I've had a lot of crazy things come through the transom one way or another. And I think that's one of the reasons why when I was early in my journalism career, I didn't really like to do interviews. I didn't like to go on TV or things like that. But as I've gotten older, I realized the more people know who you are and what you do, the better chance they'll come find you, And I've always made it possible to find me in many different ways. I've always been very public, here's an email, here's a phone number, whatever it might be. But it happens even more when you're in a newspaper, I think, because then you're on this drumbeat of coverage, every week, and people think, oh, this is the guy who covers Saudi, for example.
That might be changing though. You as the founder of Project Brazen, who's producing podcasts, producing documentaries, maybe a publisher as well at one stage, that changing media landscape could be that it's more advantageous to be in your DMs than someone at a newspaper.
Perhaps, I don't know, but we do get, a lot of our projects come from a single meeting or a call. Like we have a project right now, someone just called me and they said, I really enjoyed your book on this and I wanted to tell you my story, and I always take the call. I said, okay, interesting, and it took us a long time to get our heads around it, but now it's one of our big projects. So
is that the Illuminator?
No, this is a different one that we're doing as a documentary, but it's in the kind of it's in the kind of drug world, money laundering world, and it all started with a phone call.
So $1 billion whale is still selling well 6 years on. How well commercially did Blood and Oil do?
Well, it's hard to say in some ways. Book publishers keep their numbers to themselves about
the author.
Well, about how commercially successful they were for them. You know roughly how many books were sold and stuff. I would say, for me, my pride of those two books is that both of them surpass their advance. So usually you get a book, they give you an advance, and most books never earn enough to ever pay you again. But in those both cases, they both surpassed the advance. So I think it's because in the $1 Billion Whale became, without our even planning, to become this definitive financial scandal book, because it has so many characters from Leonardo DiCaprio to
Jordan Belfort.
all these characters. So it really became such a emblematic story. So it kind of joined the canon of business books. And then Blood and Oil, I think MBS is just so important, so in the news. People keep wanting to find out more about him, and there's 2 books about MBS. And ours is one of them, so.
The foundation of $1 Billion Whale is the world of the offshore plumbing and financial opacity and tax havens, etc. Does that whole world seep into what's happening in the Gulf?
Oh yeah, for sure. And in fact, $1 Billion Whale is how I kind of got into MBS, because at the time, so there was this big money transfer that went to the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and they were saying it came from Saudi Arabia. That was their argument. And it turned out, I learned at the time that MBS was not really playing ball with covering up this scandal. And that's kind of how I first came across MBS. There's kind of a through line between your projects over time,
Do you know if MBS has read your book?
I don't know. He hasn't indicated to me some way or another.
Do you know if it's being passed around in dissenting corners of Saudi Arabia?
Well, I can say that I went to a bookstore here in London, and they told me, I asked them, oh, by the way, I'm the author. I wanted to know how it was going.
Yeah.
And he said to me, actually, we're selling a lot of these books, but people always ask to leave the cover because the cover is actually quite aggressive.
To leave
leave the jacket cover of the book, which has got MBS with a kind of a red section that suggests blood, and because of Blood and Oil, and it's considered a very intense cover. So a lot of people wanted to read it, but they just didn't want people to see that they had that cover. So they would just leave the covers behind. So behind the counter, there was tons of the covers,
Wow. That must be a great feeling, though.
Within Saudi Arabia itself, I don't believe the book is ever going to be available. But I've never heard, I think in Saudi Arabia, in the corridors of power, they appreciated one thing about us, which was we never treated them with any disrespect. We came to them and told them from the beginning what we were trying to do. We sent a long list of what we were trying to do. Any chance we had to learn more from people in their side of the story, we took it, So there's a sense of we tried to understand, because in reality, you can't deny facts. These are factual things that happened. What you can get wrong is the motivations, the history that led to them, So I think our contribution with that book was to say, these things all happened. We all agree. But the motivations behind them, the reasons for them, are a little bit more complex than they might first seem.
Can you travel to Saudi Arabia? Do you have any trepidations about it?
Yeah, at this point, I never actually worried about traveling there. I think I might, if I were to go to any of these countries, I would try to make sure that I indicated I was coming, just because I don't want there to be any misunderstandings. Mostly
who do you write to for something like that?
Well, there's always a way, but I think I would just, I'm not afraid at all, of course, and I don't think there's any physical risk or anything like that at all. I just think that, I would only go for a reason. I wouldn't just kind of go casually.
Totally. in our last discussion, the best thing you said about being a journalist is you can go wherever you want, write whatever you want, call whoever you want. It's a pure expression of pursuing your interests. Now you're saddled with a business. Has some of this romanticization been lost?
No, not necessarily, but I think it's more about sustainability is important. So you're trying to land something. It has to land. So when you're pursuing your interests, if you have a truly obscure interest that no one else is going to be interested in, that's not going to be a sustainable choice as a media company.
What's an example like that for you?
Well, I don't think I have that point of view. I think I'm always worried about finding things that a big audience would be interested in. But that's very important. So if it's only a small audience, it's harder to justify doing it, you know? So for example, we're not a non-profit journalism company. We don't hold powerful institutions to account as our kind of mantra. Yeah. Our job is to show you how the world really works, to entertain you, to illuminate, but it's ultimately a combination of both information and entertainment. That's what we do, you know. So anything that falls outside of that, we don't really do. And so that's I think in some ways we get to have even more fun than working in a newspaper because we don't have any other obligation than that. Yeah. You know, newspapers have obligations. They have to fill a paper every day. They have to cover certain things. They're held to some sort of, as if they're nonprofits when they're really not, kind of standard, you know?
And so you're a podcaster, journalist, author, founder of a media company. How do you see the media landscape change in the next 10, 15 years? And then what are you doing to position yourself best to take maximum advantage of that?
Yeah. Well, my hope for the future is that there's more and more entrepreneurial media efforts, and that in the end, there's two sides of the equation. There's distribution, and then there's origination, authentic, original ideas and original reporting and storytelling. And they don't have to be within the same umbrella. So I would love to see a newspaper in the future or a podcast network in the future that embraces original outside voices coming in. So imagine a newspaper that's 50% written by external parties. You know, there'd have to be some quality control, but for example, we would love to contribute a monthly feature to a newspaper, you know, that ran on the front page or whatever.
The Free Press kind of does that.
So there's a lot of experiments. One of the ones I like is called Paper Trail. Mm-hmm. It's the guys that were involved in the Panama Papers, and they're based in Germany, and they write for Der Spiegel and ZDF, but they're an independent company, and I really like that. Mm-hmm. And I like the freedom to go different directions, to be more original. And if you're in a newspaper, it's very stifling in general. There's probably good ones and bad ones, but in general, it's a bureaucratic institution, a giant oil tanker that if you want to change directions is very slow. Yeah. So I think the dynamism and originality can come from letting people be entrepreneurial, you know, and having I would love for there to be more of a framework for entrepreneurial media that doesn't have to reinvent everything from scratch every time. Okay. You know, the bureaucracy of running a business or even of making money, you know. Mm-hmm. That's my hope.
And 3 years into Project Brazen? 2 years?
Yeah, it's more than 3 years now.
Okay. How hard has the journey been towards finding that profitability, finding a business model that really works time and again?
I think if we didn't constantly reinvent ourselves, we would go out of business earlier. But we constantly are on the search to optimize for the successes we want. That might mean landing a documentary project or creating a podcast that is really popular by itself, but also becomes a derivative value for other productions, or other things, other services. You know, one thing that we recently discovered about ourselves and about the documentary industry is documentary companies have very low abilities to do reporting. Mm-hmm. They're generally there to do productions. So that's why a lot of times documentary companies go and they listen to things, they read things, and they contact that person and they do a deal with them where they give up their contacts for a very small amount of money and then they take it over. Mm-hmm. But in reality, documentaries can be an original form. It doesn't have to always be derivative. So we started working with a lot of documentary companies where we are the forward recon unit out in the world, finding things, reporting things, and then we kind of partner up together. And it's kind of a innovation for us that just came out of the hunger to make this work, you know?
So the big windfalls for Project Brazen is licensing deals for major distribution on top of your original IP.
Well, I would say, for example, we made a podcast, our first, called Fat Leonard. And that was like, you know, a really definitive podcast on this story of this corruption story involving the U.S. Navy with a lot of story behind it. It's not just a boring story. So we made a deal with a company that's a very good partner of ours called SK Global, where we're making a film together. And so we are a genuine co-producer of that project. Our IP is the underlying basis for the screenplay that was written. But we also work alongside the creative team at SK to work with the screenwriter and get it refined to the most commercial best version of the story. Yeah. And then so that to us is a success. If that is when that's made as a film, that will be a big success for us. Yeah. So we're looking to make that happen repeatedly. Yeah. But there's a bit of a filter because sometimes things don't work out. So it's not every project can make it, but it's and not every project has to be designed for that. There are other ways to do it, but that would be a good outcome,
Nice. And $1 Billion Whale is also being made into a film, right?
Yes.
Or a TV show.
With the same partner. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So that one had a bit of a journey because it originally was going to be a TV show. Now it's going to be a feature. Things change in the marketplace as well. But there's a great writer working on it, and we've been working with him very closely as well. And
is Blood and Oil too sensitive to be put to TV?
I mean, we have a hope that there's a lot. So the story of Saudi Arabia is an amazing story.
It's
and I think, and not even just MBS, the origin stories of Saudi Arabia, the first dynasty, the third dynasty, which is started by MBS's grandfather, and so we really believe there's some very compelling stories, which is actually useful for the world to understand. You need to know the backstory of these countries to understand the current story. So we're kind of focused on the historical side of Saudi Arabia right now. So we're exploring some ideas.
One detail I forgot from the main part of the podcast, if you don't mind, they have Mecca, this total by chance tourism windfall where the billions of Islamic people around the world feel like they are obligated to go there. Yet somehow, once in their lives, Saudi Arabia takes a loss on Mecca. Yeah. How is that possible? Is this just mismanagement, or are they trying to provide them the best possible service to all Muslims?
I think Saudi Arabia would not be like, over the years, they would be proud to take a loss. There's like a great honor to be the home of Mecca and Medina. But in reality, it's a huge logistical nightmare. People from all around the world, there's quotas, there's visas. If you go to Mecca, there's an entire series of activities you do that are related to the Hajj, and the weather is pretty intense. Is overcrowded. There's people sneaking in a variety of ways too. So I think it's no doubt, it's no surprise that they have been running a loss. But MBS, in the way he sees the world, he thinks they shouldn't be running a loss. They should be running a profit. And perhaps they would reinvest that profit into the experience of Mecca and Medina, but. That's something they've been working on, but it's a tricky one because it's a very sensitive area. Nobody wants to be seen to be making money off of this religious experience, but on the other hand, there's how do you make this a sustainable thing?
Yeah. Before we close this, what is something about this region, the book, or your reporting that we didn't talk about that you wish we had?
I think the number one thing I would say is if you go to visit these countries, you'll find a very safe, welcoming, family-oriented society, and it's actually really nice to see, like especially Saudi Arabia because it has less of a Western presence. Everywhere you go, it's huge families traveling together en masse, and sometimes those little details never come through in the things you read or watch. So, but if you would notice if you went there, and so I think it's just important to not, orientalize places too much without having been there, So even things like sportswashing that's why those terms are so overly strong,
Yeah.
But and also if you go and speak to there, you can find a young woman in Saudi Arabia that is so excited about what's happened in her country. You can also find a young woman who left the country who's not excited. And that comes down to one thing. On one side, someone's looking for political reforms. On the other side, someone's looking for social reforms. Political reforms are not tolerated in the Gulf region. It's the one area that's completely strict. If you start having a placard calling for democracy on the streets, you will be arrested. And I'm not sure what will happen to you, how long you'll be arrested for. That is the kind of dark side of the countries. They're very insecure about their political system and about making sure it remains as it is. There's no efforts to change that political system in any of those countries. And so that's the dark side of those countries that you don't see when you come to Dubai on a holiday or whatever, is that there are no political reforms, you know.
Having been in Abu Dhabi last week, one of the dark sides that was impossible to not notice was the way the labor force was treated and the status that they held within the society, and then the just sheer absence of Emiratis anywhere except the office buildings that I would go into. Which, in my own personal opinion, is just pretty grim.
Yeah, it doesn't feel nice. You know, but there's also a difference. For example, in Saudi Arabia, you will find a Saudi person working normal jobs, like driving a taxi, like potentially working in a restaurant, whatever. In some of the smaller Gulf states, like the UAE, Qatar, maybe Kuwait to some extent, you'll find that people don't take those jobs. They only have other jobs. It's kind of a joke in the country, like they only want to be like the CEO or whatever, or the high-ranking jobs. And that has to do a little bit with the size. Like UAE has 1 million locals and then like 5 million external, you know, foreigners, whereas Saudi is 30 million locals and then hundreds of thousands of foreigners. But so I think there's an interesting kind of twist on this. So if you were to go to Kerala in India, you would find all these giant houses that belong to people who spent their lives working in these Gulf states. Really? In those Gulf states, they did not have a very good life. Right. It was a lot of sacrifice, working in crazy temperatures, wearing a complete long sleeve jumpsuit. A lot of construction workers die and it's not reported. So there's definitely a kind of class system with those construction workers at the very bottom. But if you were to tell them you can't come to the Gulf anymore, they'd be upset because they actually find that this was the way that they built a fortune. They supported their family. So it's always kind of a bit of a difficult thing. There's been efforts in a lot of these countries to improve the quality of life and build better facilities and things. There's some that are really bad and terrible. But I always thought that in the UAE, they're missing a trick, especially because I spent time there. In Saudi, this will be increasingly true. There should be a giant sculpture, like on the main road, of a construction worker that's from Kerala, India, because those are the guys that built all the buildings, you know? Yes, you may have lucked into this wealth and had a vision for a building, but these guys are the ones that built the buildings. There should be a pride about them, you know?
Yeah, but doesn't that go against the idolatry?
Yeah, no, it goes against it, but I think it's a huge mistake, you know? It's a huge mistake to think that anything like that, you know? But that's my American side thinking.
You want to build statues.
For construction workers.
What was the geographical reason why Saudi can grow to 30 million, whereas the Emirates is only 1 million? What makes these lands more fertile to support huge populations?
That's a good question. I don't actually know the exact answer. My speculation would be that Saudi Arabia was much bigger and had more people to start with, you know? So, and then with the discovery of oil, that's when the population explosion began, because everything was subsidized. You essentially didn't have to properly work. Like the state was funding all of this. Yeah. Every child, school is paid for, healthcare is paid for, including abroad, you know? Yeah. So everyone just had lots of children, you know? So there was a demographic explosion. Nice. I think probably in the other Gulf states there's been a demographic explosion, but from a smaller base population, you know?
So that won't show into the statistics for a few generations.
Yeah.
Finally, mate, since having started Project Brazen for yourself and Tom, what type of serendipity has entered your life because of this company?
Well, I don't know. I think in a way it's introduced a sense of adventure that I never expected to have. So, you know, you're meeting people for different reasons than you'd ever had done before. I think if I had just stayed at a newspaper, I would be doing a couple of front page stories a year, you know, and it would have been less satisfying to me than to have to try to grapple with bigger questions, even like methodologies and also I never previously managed any other people in my job. So that's also been something that I've enjoyed, you know, working with young journalists and seeing them discover what their skills are and what their best things are. So yeah, I think I have no regrets, though it's definitely 10 times more stressful.
Well, phenomenal, mate. So generous of you to have me in your studio and for your time. And, you know, you couldn't find a bigger fan of what you're doing, truly.
Thank you. I appreciate it.